The subcommittee will come to order. I ask unanimous consent that the chair be authorized to declare a recess at any time during today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. I also ask unanimous consent that members not on the subcommittee be permitted to sit with the subcommittee at today's hearing and ask questions. Without objection, so ordered. For members participating remotely, please let committee staff know as soon as possible if you are experiencing connectivity issues or technical problems. To avoid any inadvertent background noise, I request that every member please keep their microphones muted when not seeking recognition to speak. Should I hear any inadvertent background noise, I will request that the member please mute their microphone. And finally, to insert a document into the record, please have your staff email it to documenttandi@mail.house.gov. With that, we will commence our hearing. Good morning, and welcome to today's Coast Guard and Maritime Transportation Subcommittee hearing on practical steps toward a carbon-free maritime industry. Today, we will examine the progress towards eliminating carbon emissions in the maritime industry and how Congress can support these efforts. This work is crucial to mitigating the effects of climate change. Without decisive action in the maritime industry and elsewhere, we are going to experience severe impacts on our way of life from sea level rise, flooding, and more frequent extreme weather events. Climate change is one of the most important challenges of our time. As we seek solutions, we must capitalize on the opportunity to promote American innovation and bolster the American workforce. Burning fossil fuels in the maritime industry and elsewhere results in emissions of greenhouse gases and other pollutants that are harmful to human health. Greenhouse gases also absorb and trap heat in our atmosphere, which has led to shifts in regional climate patterns that have consequences for our food and water systems, public and private infrastructure, and national security. The science is crystal clear. We are vulnerable to climate changes due to human actions. Over the past 171 years, human activities have raised atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide by 48% above pre-industrial levels found in 1850. The last time the atmospheric carbon dioxide amounts were this high was more than 3 million years ago. Let me say that again, more than 3 million years ago, when temperature was 3.6 to 5.4 degrees higher than during the pre-industrial era, and sea level was 50 to 80 feet higher than today. Unfortunately, many of the worst air pollution problems can occur in our near communities comprised of minority populations. Port communities are directly exposed to nitrous oxide, sulfur dioxide, and particulate matter, and have some of the country's highest asthma rates. Many of these citizens make up our maritime and longshore workforce, so their health is not only a moral issue, but also a public good for sustaining maritime commerce. Commerce by sea is cleaner and safer than transportation by land, and we should do everything possible to encourage more waterborne transportation. But traditional maritime fuel emits harmful greenhouse gases, contributing to global and regional climate change. International shipping accounts for 3% of the world's carbon emissions, and if it were a country, the sector would be the world's 6th largest emitter. The International Maritime Organization has set an ambitious goal of reducing carbon dioxide emissions by 50% before 2050, which is not possible unless the industry takes immediate and aggressive action. But that is not enough. Maritime carbon emissions must be eliminated if we are to avoid the most devastating impacts of climate change. While the challenge can seem daunting, we must recognize and capitalize on the opportunity for American industry to innovate and lead the pack. If we develop new forms of energy generation, we can also create jobs for the American people. We are already seeing positive steps taken by ports, vessel owners, shipyards, academic institutions, and state and local governments, such as the Santa Barbara Air Pollution Control District in the Central Coast of California, which I represent. The Air Pollution Control District has developed a vessel speed reduction program named Protecting Blue Whales and Blue Skies that has not only cut emissions, but has reduced noise pollution in our local waterways and avoided vessel strikes with local maritime mammals. I know Representative Lowenthal had a lot to do with these efforts in his area as well, in the Port of Long Beach and the Long Beach region. I am convinced that if we think outside the box, we can bolster our maritime industry, create new jobs, and position America as a leader in maritime technologies. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses, our expert witnesses, on ways to reach our ambitious emissions goals while stimulating the U.S. economy and domestic job growth. I ask unanimous consent to insert statements from the Ocean Conservancy into the hearing record. Without objection, so be it. With that, I now call on Ranking Member of the subcommittee, Mr. Gibbs, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In 2018, the International Maritime Organization issued its initial strategy on the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions from shipping, and a revised strategy is due in 2023. Industry has responded by beginning to develop, test, and use new fuels and new technologies. I look forward to hearing today what the cost of the industry-wide recapitalization that decarbonization will require and who will bear the cost. I'm also interested if these changes will be done in line with planned vessel replacements. I'm also interested in which technologies and fuels show promise for which sectors, and whether the witnesses expect multiple technologies and fuels to be used in the future instead of a single fuel. In the past, wind-powered vessels were succeeded by coal, which was succeeded by bunker fuel. It appears the next transition may be to an array of fuels and technologies rather than the linear movement from a single dominant fuel to a different single dominant fuel. In addition to decarbonization vessel fuel, efforts to reduce air emissions are also underway at ports. Again, I am interested in the status and cost of these efforts. While the IMO has set goals for vessel emission standards, what are the goals for reduction of emission standards at our ports? Will ocean carriers and ultimately U.S. importers and exporters bear these costs? I look forward to what today's witnesses have to tell us about methods, costs, and any efficiencies to be gained through efforts to decarbonize vessel and port operations. Again, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Gibbs. Now I'd like to recognize Chairman DeFazio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your having this hearing on this really interesting and important topic. I think I've tasked every subcommittee to look at ways to reduce carbon emissions within their jurisdiction, and this is an important contribution to that effort. With COVID-19 disrupting global cargo, the role of the maritime industry has become more apparent to many more people over the last year. And then, of course, the high publicity with the blockage of the Suez Canal by Ever Given. I think that now that folks are becoming aware that the majority of everything they consume is involved in maritime transportation, that there'll be a little more focus on the industry in the future, and I think this gives us an opportunity to begin to deal with the industry's carbon pollution. They're already moving away from the dirty bunker fuels under an international agreement. They are already the most fuel-efficient way per ton to move freight, but there are possibilities to move much more in a direction to reduce their carbon emissions. They're 3% now, 10% by 2050, without significant changes. There's a lot of interesting research going on. There's a company in my state called Element One, And their technology utilizes seawater, the most, I guess, plentiful thing on Earth, and methanol to produce hydrogen, to run hydrogen fuel cells and run a hydrogen fuel cell ship. This has tremendous potential. It's a 50% carbon reduction if you use standard methanol, and obviously carbon neutral if you use a renewable methanol. Our ports are, as the chairman mentioned, coming from Southern California, they're already hard at work to try and eliminate carbon pollution in the ports with the drayage trucks, with the equipment that moves containers around and other operations. They're looking at electrification. It's capital intensive. And I'm sure that our international competitors are going to be subsidizing this, and I think there's a role for the federal government to be involved. There are many steps that we could take. Grant funding for ports, looking to add shoreside power hookups for vessels to run on electricity while they're at dock, to purchase electric cargo handling equipment, construct microgrids, integrate clean energy sources, which could involve offshore wind or tidal power or wave power, given the situation of our particular ports. And we want to be the innovator in these areas. We want to lead the world, and we want to begin to export these technologies, just like we used to lead the world in so many things before. And that's also part of the president's plan, is to restore our international competitiveness instead of being a country that is totally dependent upon imports, to be, again, someone who is more focused on exporting technology and creating jobs here at home. So I think there's a lot of opportunities here for long-lasting middle-class jobs, longshore mariners, shipbuilders, an industry that we need, is essential as a maritime nation. And with these new technologies, we could be leading the world. So there's no one-size-fits-all for this. And so, today in the hearing, we'll hear of a number of different approaches. And I appreciate, again, the opportunity to become educated more on the subject. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Chairman DeFazio. I would now like to welcome the witnesses on our panel. First, we have Mr. John Butler, President and Chief Executive Officer, World Shipping Council. Second, we have Ms. Kristen Decas, Chief Executive Officer and Port Director, the Port of Hueneme. Next, we have Mr. Morgan Fanberg, President of Gloucester. Next, we have Dr. Lee Kinberg, Director of Environment and Sustainability with Maersk. Last, we have Dr. Dan Rutherford, Program Director and Regional Lead for International Council on Clean Transportation. Thank you for being here today, and I look forward to hearing your testimony. Before we begin, I would like to turn it over and recognize my colleague, Representative Julia Brownlee, who represents the district to the south of my district, to say a few words about Ms. Decas and the Port of Hueneme, who I also adopt as partially my port because they're right on the border of her district and my district. And with that, Representative Brownlee.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for allowing me to be here this morning to introduce Kristen Decas, a constituent of mine and the CEO and Port Director of the Oxnard Harbor District and Port of Hueneme and Ventura County. You could not have chosen a better witness for today's hearing, which is appropriately entitled Practical Steps Toward a Carbon-Free Maritime Industry, Updates on Fuels, Ports, and Technology. Without a doubt, Ms. Decas is one of the nation's leading experts in what our nation's ports are doing to address the threats posed by the climate crisis. Ms. Decas has been instrumental in working to strengthen the Port of Hueneme's commitment to staying on the leading edge of environmental stewardship. Through her extraordinary leadership, the Port of Hueneme became the first port in California to earn the Green Marine certification in 2017. This is a voluntary industry program that looks at multiple environmental performance indicators at ports, including air emissions, prevention of spills and leakages, community impacts, and environmental leadership. Under her stewardship, the port has installed plug-in power systems for ships that come into the port so that they can turn off their diesel engines and reduce carbon emissions. The port is also proactively developing its Port of Hueneme Reducing Emissions Supporting Health Clean Air Plan in partnership with our local air quality regulatory agency, the Ventura County Air Pollution Control District. This port has also implemented new technologies and best practices, including a new zero waste policy phasing in high mast LED lighting to reduce energy use and light pollution, overhauling a harbor patrol boat to reduce emissions, switching to compostable supplies, and hosting zero waste events, and a lot more. The port has been dogged in their pursuit of new grant opportunities to help the port build greener infrastructure and procure zero emission cargo handling equipment, and Congress has a critical role to play to ensure our ports have access to necessary federal resources to help them transition towards a cleaner, greener future. And I was delighted to have the chairman of the full committee, Peter DeFazio, visit the Port of Hueneme, and as the Port of Hueneme's representative in Congress, along with our subcommittee chair here today, I could not be more proud of the work that is being done by the port commissioners and by Ms. Dekas and her team of talented professionals to keep our local port clean and green. And I'm very proud to be here today to introduce all of you to a wonderful leader and my constituent, Ms. Kristen Dekas. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity, and I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Brownlee. Let me just say, I grew up in Oxnard, breathing a lot of those emissions, so I'm grateful for the port becoming the greenest port in the nation and helping alleviate the public health concerns that are associated sometimes with some of our ports and neighboring communities. With that, we will proceed to our witnesses. Without objection, our witness full statement will be included in the record. Since your written testimony has been made a part of the record, the subcommittee requests that you please limit your oral testimony to 5 minutes. Ms. Butler, you may proceed.
Chairman Carbajal, Ranking Member Gibbs, Full Committee Chairman DeFazio, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I am John Butler, President and CEO of the World Shipping Council. Our members provide 90% of global container ship capacity and offer a significant percentage of the world's vehicle carrier fleet.
It's not working. So somebody keep... Please proceed. Sorry about that.
The subcommittee's focus today on practical solutions to decarbonization of shipping is right on point. We face a huge challenge. Over the coming decades, we need to convert the world's international fleet to low or no carbon fuels and associated technologies. And we have to do that in a way that does not undermine the essential transportation services that make the global economy function. I would like to emphasize 2 points today. My first point is that although there are some promising low and zero carbon fuels and technologies under consideration, we simply do not yet know which of these options will end up being viable for the long haul. This is not a matter of simply picking an available fuel and getting on with it. The fact is that all of the future fuels under consideration have significant issues that have to be overcome in terms of safety, energy density, life cycle carbon profile, and other challenges. In order to reach a point where investment capital will flow to create fuel production and delivery infrastructure for alternative fuels, we need much greater technological certainty about what fuels and technologies will turn out to be truly sustainable from an operational, safety, environmental, and economic perspective. To get that technological and investment certainty, we must accelerate the necessary research and development now. Current R&D efforts are fragmented, and dedicated funding and global scale are missing. To address that R&D gap, the shipping industry in December of 2019 proposed that the International Maritime Organization create the International Maritime Research and Development Board, or IMRB. The IMRB would be a research, coordination, and funding effort paid for by industry that would deploy $5 billion over 10 years to identify alternative fuels and move them towards commercial viability. That proposal has now been co-sponsored by 10 IMO member countries, along with the entire shipping industry. And the latest version of that very detailed proposal is attached to my written testimony. United States research institutions would be well placed to participate in the work funded by the IMRB. And there will be collateral clean air and technology development benefits beyond GHG reduction that would come from the work that the IMRB can do. We strongly urge the United States to back this proposal when it is next discussed in the IMO in June of this year. My second and final point is that it is critical for the United States to engage actively both at the IMO and with other nations. Decisions are being made today that will affect the industry and the country's international trade for the foreseeable future. And we have to get this right. One threat to a global solution is that the European Union is proposing to apply its internal carbon pricing scheme to ships operating far beyond EU waters. That raises trade and sovereignty concerns, and it threatens to undermine the ability of the IMO to implement a global solution. That EU proposal will be released in more detail, probably in June of this year, and it is worth the attention of the United States government. I thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Butler. You're right on time. We will proceed next with Ms. Kristen Dekas.
Good morning, Chairman Carvajal, Ranking Member Gibbs, and members of the subcommittee, and Congresswoman Brownlee. My name is Kristen Dekas, and I am CEO and Port Director of the Port of Hueneme in Southern California. On behalf of my Board of Harbor Commissioners, I would like to express my appreciation for the opportunity to appear before this subcommittee today. We are looking at a moment in history where timely action by Commerce promises to reshape the future of our nation through federal investment in transportation systems. Such action will allow investments of taxpayer dollars to go where they are needed most, to the creation of family-sustaining jobs with higher than average wages for disadvantaged communities. The outcome will be the transformation of social equity, the advancement of carbon-free transportation network, and growth in trade, ensuring our nation is the most competitive in the world. It is critical to note the importance ports have in driving local and regional economies. The total economic value generated by U.S. coastal ports totals $5.4 trillion, roughly 26% of GDP. U.S. port activity employs over 30.8 million Americans. Last year, Port of Hueneme's trade with the world reached $10.85 billion, generating over $1.7 billion in economic impact and creating over 15,800 trade-related jobs. This profound economic stimulus does have an impact on our environment and community, and as with any negative, there is a cure and a pathway forward. California ports not only lead the nation, but the world in environmental achievement. California ports are the only ports that require refrigerated cargo ships to electrify at berth, making them zero emission at port complexes. Collectively, California's 11 deepwater seaports realized emission reductions on the order of 80% in PM, 90% in SOx, and 50% at NOx. At the Port of Hueneme, we more than live up to this legacy of environmental achievement and tradition. Since 2008, the port achieved an 85% reduction in PM. In 2012, we completed a comprehensive environmental framework that sets goals in air quality, water quality, marine resources, soil and sediment, energy, and climate change. In 2014, we installed our shoreside power system to enable ships to plug in at berth. In partnership with Tesla, we installed 5 battery packs to purchase power at off-peak hours and store it for daytime use. We are currently engineering and installing new electrical infrastructure to power hybrid electric mobile cranes, zero-emission trucks, and zero-emission yard tractors. Our board approved the purchase of the first 2 zero-emission heavy-duty port trucks in Ventura counties. These American-made Calmar battery-powered trucks will move containers of fresh produce around the port while producing zero pollution. I would now like to respectfully recommend the course of action Congress should take to propel the future of the goods movement industry to a sustainable and decarbonized transportation sector. Assess and invest. Assess and build the blueprint. Abraham Lincoln once said, "Give me 6 hours to chop down a tree and I will spend the first 4 sharpening the axe." There needs to be a true understanding of all the complexities of a paradigm shift to decarbonization. This requires the development of a blueprint to effectively transition to a new fuel economy, which includes a nationwide feasibility and cost analysis. For example, the capacity of our nation's utility networks, infrastructure availability, and upgrade costs need to be fully evaluated and understood. At the Port of Hueneme, the forecasted cost for electric infrastructure is $28.5 million. This cost does not include the utility company's infrastructure improvements that will be required, estimated to run $50+ million. Furthermore, the feasibility costs of retrofitting vessels and other private sector assets need to be factored into the plan. The Port of Hueneme is one example of millions across the country where these dynamics need to be flushed out and the roadmap defined so the investments made by the federal government are well informed by true costs, science, and technological viability. Invest in maritime and transportation infrastructure. For California ports alone, experts forecast the cost to replace current equipment with zero emission or near zero emission equipment to exceed $23 billion and $35 billion to replace current equipment with electrified high density equipment and supporting infrastructure, all prior to utility upgrades. So invest in a zero emission future, invest in a new alternative fuel economy, invest in resilient infrastructure, and invest in a just transition. Infrastructure's investments in places like Port of Hueneme and Oxnard will foster positive social reform and racial equity. In closing, California ports such as the Port of Hueneme are pioneers of testing, innovating, and taking on risk of implementing new technologies that lower emissions. As early adopters, California ports have expertise and best practices in what works. Today, the Port of Hueneme is excited to partner with you to help prosper federal action to assess and invest in our future. Thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony.
Thank you, Ms. Deckers. You were well ahead of your time, so thank you. Next, we will proceed to Mr. Morgan Fanberg.
Thank you, Chairman Carvajal, Ranking Member Gibbs, and subcommittee members for the opportunity to speak with you today. As a US-based naval architecture firm, Gloston has been working to decarbonize the marine industry for more than a decade. Creating a carbon-free maritime industry is an unprecedented challenge that creates a unique opportunity for US technology developers. However, foreign competition is better funded and is currently leading the decarbonization technology race. So how can the US lead when we have less than 3% of the world's ocean-going fleet? Well, we can make the greatest impact by focusing our decarbonization efforts on the US domestic fleet, which is one of the world's largest, consisting of ferries, tugs, dredges, coastal tankers, and other vessels. We need a national strategic initiative plan with a focused vision and an urgent timeline. MARAD and the Department of Energy are the agencies to lead these efforts. This plan should include the following 3 actions to accelerate US progress. First, DOE should increase port and terminal infrastructure funding for electric vessel charging and alternative fuel bunkering. Electrifying ships already comes at a premium, therefore adding costs for shoreside infrastructure will be quite difficult for private operators to fully bear without government assistance. The benefits of electric harbor vessels cannot be realized without this infrastructure, much like the electric car industry cannot thrive without roadside charging stations. Likewise, bunkering alternative fuels can require specialized fueling infrastructure that will be difficult to scale without government support. Second, MARAD has the experience to bring together academia, government technology providers, and vessel operators. By funding consortiums such as Washington State's Maritime Blue, we can pilot demonstrate, and commercialize carbon neutral and carbon zero technologies for our domestic fleet. In the US, we have the needed resources from these following groups: universities and national labs for fundamental research into alternative fuels, hydrogen, ammonia, methanol, nuclear, green diesel, or other renewable fuels. Industry partners such as vessel operators, equipment suppliers, and naval architects to convert research into practical technologies that are ready for demonstration and commercialization. And maritime academies, where we can use the new fleet of training vessels now under construction as platforms for testing and proving emerging technologies, while also preparing cadets and midshipmen for the future. The third and final step in this plan is development of a streamlined regulatory process that encourages new technologies, provides certainty from design through construction, and prevents project time delays. This process is critical to the US, to the success of any US-led effort. We at Gloston are involved in several collaboration projects. Two that represent partnerships are: first, the Gloston Beaker Foil Ferry. This is a modern composite hydrofoil all-electric passenger ferry. It requires less than half of the installed power of a typical high-speed passenger catamaran. This project is a great example of the partnership that MARAD can foster. In our case, Washington State's Maritime Blue has brought our technology team together with local operators, ports, builders, and the classification agency, DNV. Our cluster was recently awarded a $400,000 FTA grant to further the design, which is fantastic. However, by comparison, a UK-based developer of a competing design was awarded a $45 million government grant to not only design, but also build and demonstrate their concept. Second, as part of a MARAD-funded project, Gloston, Sandia National Laboratories, and Scripps Institution of Oceanography worked together to design a hydrogen-fueled coastal research vessel. The design proved the feasibility to build and operate a coastal research vessel powered solely by hydrogen fuel cells. This is a shovel-ready project requiring federal funding for construction, so it can demonstrate the effectiveness of alternative fuel technology, not only for research vessels, but for other longer-range coastal ships. By comparison, the EU's Horizon 2020 program funded, through a $25 million grant, the construction of a Norwegian hydrogen-powered cargo vessel due to be launched in 2024. So, in summary, the global maritime industry has not faced a more daunting challenge since vessels moved from sail power to steam. Action must be taken now to tackle the amount of scientific and engineering work required to move the industry to carbon-free in the next 25 to 30 years. We have the key resources ready to meet this challenge, but if we delay, we will watch as foreign countries develop future technologies in equipment, fuels, and infrastructure. We have a great opportunity to showcase American leadership and ingenuity. But similar to so many of our nation's historic challenges, no single entity can get us to our goals. We need government to partner with academia and private industry to develop, deploy, and demonstrate decarbonization technologies to achieve emission targets and position the United States as the global maritime leader. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fanberg. Next, we will go to Dr. Lee Kinberg.
Thank you, Chairman Carbajal. And may I get a sound check?
We could hear you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Carbajal, Ranking Member Gibbs, Chairman DeFazio, and members of the committee. Thank you for the invitation to speak today. I'm Lee Kinberg, and I'm Head of Environment and Sustainability for North America for Maersk, a global logistics and container shipping company. This is a really exciting time to be in shipping, as you've heard, a time of change that will transform the industry as much as containerization did in the 20th century. And ocean shipping is already the most energy efficient way to move cargo long distances and has the lowest carbon footprint of any mode of transportation. Those ships use very large diesel engines to move these mountains of cargo, and that generates greenhouse gases, primarily carbon dioxide or carbon, and other pollutants. Now, reducing these emissions requires both improving energy efficiency and new carbon neutral fuels and technologies. And there are likely to be several winners since there's several types of shipping. Our customers and other stakeholders need us to provide carbon neutral shipping to enable them to meet their zero carbon goals. In December 2018, we made a commitment to do just that, to achieve carbon neutral shipping by 2050 for our entire fleet. We also set 2030 goals for energy efficiency and a goal of launching our first carbon neutral vessel by 2030. At the time, that really seemed like a moonshot goal. Today, we see it as still a very challenging target, but clearly possible to reach. And I'd like to report today on progress we're making on that. Since 2008, we have reduced our emissions by 47% per container moved. So this is an energy efficiency effort. Today's customers are actually paying a premium for our carbon neutral eco delivery shipping service that is new just in the last year. It's small, but it's growing. We're also already testing bio-based fuels, batteries, and other technologies on commercial vessels, and we're evaluating other fuels. And there is a table in the written statement that goes into details of some of those other fuels. We're developing a new renewable fuel using ethanol and lignin from agricultural and forest wood wastes. This work is supported in part by several of our major customers. So again, the support from our customers is critical. In March of this year, we announced that our first carbon neutral container vessel would be operational by 2023, 7 years earlier than our 2030 commitment. This will be the world's first carbon neutral liner vessel. And this and all of our new vessels have been committed to be capable of using those new carbon neutral fuels. This particular vessel will be powered by green methanol, a fuel which is not available on this scale today. The limited supply of fuels like green methanol is a bottleneck for decarbonizing the industry. We believe this commitment is the best way to kickstart the rapid scaling of carbon neutral fuels and also give us operational experience and provide a carbon neutral product for our customers. Now, the biggest challenges ahead are not just on the ships. The land-based industries and infrastructure must be there to supply those fuels and technologies at scale. And we have to do it sustainably without jeopardizing food production or forests. Economic and policy systems must also adapt to support this transformation. Now, there will probably be more than one winner in the work to develop new fuels and energy sources, and likely competition between shipping and other industries to develop and purchase those fuels. So what will it take to make this happen? Well, focused R&D with collaboration across the industry and with other related industries. Alignment between national and international goals and metrics. The International Maritime Organization, IMO, sets the rules for international shipping and has set and is tightening the metrics and goals for vessel emissions even as we speak. And then measure what matters for good decision making and to avoid stranded assets. Include the full set of greenhouse gases, both upstream and downstream impacts. And that I mean by the impact of fuel production, distribution, and use all count. You have to look at it from well to wake and not just look at the stat gas emissions. Requirements need to be clear, performance-based, enforced, and encourage early action, not penalize it. And both incentives and enforcement should be part of future climate programs. Ladies and gentlemen, this is an energy transformation. It is not a new fuel or a vessel modification. Huge changes to both vessel design and land-based infrastructures must happen to produce and distribute those new energy sources. And policies, metrics, and laws must adapt to enable that change. So thank you for this opportunity to provide this progress report, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Kinberg. Now we will go to Dr. Dan Rutherford.
Good morning, Chairman Carbajal, Ranking Member Gibbs, Chairman DeFazio, Congresswoman Brownlee, and other subcommittee members. I appreciate the opportunity to testify today on behalf of the International Council on Clean Transportation. The ICCT is an independent, nonprofit research organization headquartered in Washington, D.C., with offices in San Francisco, Berlin, Beijing, and Sao Paulo. ICCT employs a team of over 100 transportation experts that advise policymakers on how to improve the environmental performance of the transport sector. Maritime shipping is a cornerstone of our modern economy, but it comes with impacts. Air pollution from shipping is linked to at least 64,000 premature deaths per year globally, with underprivileged and minority communities living near ports feeling the brunt of the impact. In 2018, global shipping emitted about 1 billion tons of carbon dioxide, or more than the German and Dutch economies combined. Much work lies ahead if the sector is to meet the UN goal of cutting greenhouse gas emissions from international shipping by at least 50% from 2008 levels by 2050. To meet this goal, we'll need zero-emission deep-sea ships on the water by no later than 2030. Key technologies include battery electric ships for near-port operations and short-sea shipping, hydrogen, which in pressurized or cryogenic form can power fuel cells that are already available and scalable, and ammonia, which is gaining attention as an easy-to-store hydrogen carrier. These fuels can be generated from abundant renewable electricity with a negligible climate footprint. Today, we're already seeing fully battery electric and fuel cell zero-emission vessels, especially ferries and barges on short dedicated routes. Infrastructure investments for fast charging for battery electric ships can also support shore power to reduce at-port air pollution. We expect full-sized deep-sea zero-emission vessels running on hydrogen fuel cells or burning renewable ammonia to be possible as soon as 2030. Hybrid or fully zero-emission regional cargo ships will be available even sooner. Technologies like wind-assisted propulsion and whole air lubrication will help reduce energy use and make zero-carbon fuels more competitive. A word of caution. Biofuels and liquefied natural gas are being used now, but neither is a reliable bridge to zero-emission vessels. Sustainable biofuel supply is limited, in demand by a variety of sectors, and must be generated from waste, and also not result in deforestation in order to be sustainable. LNG produces about 25% less CO2 when combusted, but due to methane leaks upstream during the production of LNG and also downstream from the engine itself, LNG is often worse for the climate than conventional fuels after accounting for its full life cycle emissions. The coming transition to zero-emission shipping can be a win for the US economy, the environment, and human health. Zero-emission vessels eliminate air pollution from the ships themselves, easing the health burdens of coastal and near-port communities. ZEVs avoid the water pollution generated by ships that use sulfur scrubbers. They're also quieter, and ZEVs will unlock new careers to develop advanced engines, fuel cells, batteries, and fuels. The production and sale of zero-emission marine fuels in particular is a major opportunity for US businesses. Today, the largest vessels visiting US ports are often fueled abroad, not here at home. Producing zero-emission marine fuels like electricity, hydrogen, and ammonia domestically will provide new economic opportunities for Americans while protecting vulnerable near-port communities. So, what actions can the US government take to support the ZEV transition? First, we need substantial investments to develop and deploy zero-emission vessels and fuels, along with supporting port electrification and infrastructure. US-flagged Jones Act vessels, which operate shorter routes between regular ports, can be used to demonstrate and mature the technologies we'll need for deep-sea ZEVs. Second, the US should work with key trading partners, including Canada, Mexico, the EU, and China, to establish zero-emission vessel corridors and associated infrastructure. Finally, the US should lead in negotiating ambitious international standards for larger ships at the International Maritime Organization. These actions can reduce climate and air pollution from shipping, improve the health and well-being of port communities, and help unlock new markets for zero-emission vessels and fuels. Thank you for the opportunity to present today.
Thank you, Dr. Rutherford. With that, we'll move on to our questions. We will now move on to member questions. Each member will be recognized for 5 minutes. And first, we will start with Chairman DeFazio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, to Dr. Kinberg, I'm just the biofuel that you're going to use. I mean, right now there's virtually no availability for that 2023 target. How is that? I mean, you're going to need it on both ends of a voyage, right? So I'm just curious about the capability of supply and what we need to produce this.
When I had an update on this, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, when I had an update on the fuel availability on this, I learned from our Maersk Oil trading team that we were talking to something like 35 or 37 different suppliers of these fuels to start to ramp this up. You know, the first time you do something like this, it's going to take some effort, but we feel that this is a really important signal to send to these suppliers that there will be a demand for these. Otherwise, you get into the chicken and the egg.
All right. And I was also intrigued by the bio-based ethanol with the polymer lignin. You want to tell me a little bit about that? I mean, what's the advantage of adding the lignin? Does that make it a higher value fuel, or what's that?
Well, lignin actually has it comes from agricultural waste. It's what make plant stems stiff. So it's the second most common biopolymer in the world. It's available from paper mill effluents, all kinds of waste products. And you can mix it into an alcohol, a renewable alcohol, and come up with a fuel that has the potential to be more cost effective. So as you know, one of the real costs with these new fuels, or one of the real challenges with these new fuels, is the cost. You're looking at something like double the cost, even for some of the fuels that are more readily available. So I probably ought to stop there, but I'm pretty passionate about this topic. So
Well, no,
if you want to know more about it later, I'm glad to have the conversation.
well, I just will say, I mean, we have this issue with straw. My district is the largest producer of grass seed in the world. And for years, they would torch the fields to get rid of, pests and potential weeds and things like that. And our skies, when it stopped raining finally in Oregon, the skies would go dark and we're all breathing smoke all summer. Finally, it's been substantially banned, but now there isn't, the market for that straw. So I assume that straw would be a potential lignin source.
I would assume so too. I know that bagasse that's used for making sorghum, for example, is a source of lignin.
Okay, well, I'm gonna have to.
So there could be all kinds of opportunities here rather than just burning that stuff.
Yeah, no, well, now they're dealing with it in alternate ways and trying to ship it places, but the market is not that adequate. So thanks. And then to Mr. Fanberg, I got to say it was sounded a little pessimistic in terms of where we are vis-a-vis foreign competition in these areas. Do you want to be a little more specific about that and what steps specifically we should take to begin to at least be partially competitive?
Well, so on the foreign competition, that one example I used about our foil ferry project, we do have stiff competition, and it's very well funded. This is where the industry is headed with passenger ferries and efficiency when it comes to foil-bound ferries. And so that was one example of a very well-funded foreign competitor in the UK. I didn't mean to sound overly pessimistic, because I do think that this meeting and the action that is happening, not just from Gloucester's point of view, but from other naval architects, is very encouraging. That we are working hard, but the funding source is our difficulty when it comes to demonstrating these new technologies. We have enough funding to get started to do design work, but when it comes to actually demonstrating and putting something on the water, that's where the gap is.
So you mentioned potentially MARAD and DOE, correct?
Yes, that's true. Yeah.
Okay. We'll have to pursue that then. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Chairman DeFazio. Next, we'll go to Ranking Member Gibbs.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the witnesses being here today. The International Maritime Organization has set greenhouse gas reductions targets of 40% in 2030, 50% in 2050 from the 2008 levels. The World Shipping Council says that these targets can only be met if shipping moves from fossil fuels to low or zero carbon fuels that are not available today. Mr. Butler, do you envision the industry will be able to convert existing vessels to the use of these new fuels? And I guess if so, what cost to the shippers and consumers? And if not, will existing vessels be scrapped early, and at what cost? Mr. Butler.
Thank you, Congressman. A couple of points, just a point of clarification on the IMO 2030 goal. That 40% is an efficiency goal as opposed to an absolute goal. We do think that with current efforts underway, we will be able to meet the 2030 goal with existing ships through additional efficiency gains. The 2050 goal of 50% is an absolute reduction. And in order to get that, given the growth in trade, we are absolutely going to have to move to low and zero carbon fuels. And that's going to be the energy transition that Dr. Rutherford and Dr. Kinberg talked about. In direct answer to your question about retrofitting existing vessels, there's been a lot of work already done on existing vessels in order to meet the requirements that we're faced with in the immediate future. Whether or not existing vessels can be retrofitted to be essentially zero carbon will depend entirely on what technologies and fuels we end up using in the 2050 timeframe. And as I testified earlier, we simply don't know yet what those are going to be. We don't know what's going to come out on top. So really, in order to answer your question, we have to do the research and development that I talked about so that we know what technologies we're talking about.
So there's a lot of unknowns then, obviously, 'cause we don't know what the technologies or what the fuels are going to be. So you don't know if it's going to be one single fuel or multiple different fuels. That's just all up in the air right now, right?
It is. I think for different ship types and different applications, we've already seen, and we've heard a bit today, for example, very short sea and ferry applications, you can look at things like electrification, but for deep sea transoceanic ships that have to carry their fuel for thousands and thousands of miles, those solutions won't be there. We'll probably see multiple fuels, but you have to remember that ships move all over the planet. And so having a consistent source of fuel, no matter what port you go to, is pretty critical. I think that for the deep sea fleet, ultimately, that will push us in the direction of a smaller number of fuels than we have for the coastal fleets.
Thank you. Mr. Fanberg, you stated that the Department of Energy and MARAD should take the lead in developing decarbonized U.S. vessels. Since the U.S. Coast Guard inspects and documents such vessels, what role should the Coast Guard play in this process?
Thank you, Ranking Member Gibbs, for the question. Yes, the Coast Guard should actually take a very active role. As I mentioned in the 3 steps there in the Strategic Initiative Plan, that 3rd step was to coordinate with the Coast Guard to get ahead of these future technologies and get regulations in place ahead of these projects that we put in place. Timely regulatory review, timely new regulations are critical to any of the success of these projects that are coming.
Dr. Kinberg from Maersk, you talked about your feeder vessel being the first carbon neutral container vessel. Was this vessel really a test bed for for technologies to use later on your larger ocean-going ships? And because you also commented about the cost of fuel being double. So what's the role of this new vessel you just talked about that available in a couple of years, you said?
Well, this new vessel will be powered by green methanol. We are actually testing several technologies on commercial vessels today. For example, we have a battery being tested on the Maersk Cape Coast, and we have actually commercial use of biofuels on several vessels sailing out of Europe, because that's where that fuel is available. So yes, we are looking at test beds, but this vessel in particular is to give us some serious operating experience, particularly with fuel that has a low flash point. In other words, it's more flammable than the typical bunker fuels that we're used to using.
I'm out of your time, so I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Ranking Member Gibbs. Now I will recognize myself to be followed by each member for an additional 5 minutes of questions. With that, Ms. Decas, as I mentioned earlier, in my district, the Santa Barbara County Air Pollution Control District has done some remarkable work with vessels on lowering speeds as they approach the coast and ports through the Protecting Blue Whales and Blue Skies program. This work has reduced emissions from vessels still burning fossil fuels and has had a positive impact on our local air quality. Ms. Dekas, can you talk about how your port has assisted in getting vessels to participate in reducing speeds and how this, coupled with new emissions reducing technology, can help the port reduce overall emissions and improve air quality for the surrounding areas? The public health burden of port emissions often falls on nearby disadvantaged communities of color. What work has the Port of Hueneme done to engage local communities to ensure their concerns are heard?
Okay, I'll start with the first one. Blue Wells, Blue Skies. Our customers do actively participate in this program. We strongly encourage it, and several of them have received awards, and I'll submit those awards to you so they can get into the congressional record. We're looking in terms of clean air emissions, a variety of technologies. One is something called a SOC, where, or not quite a SOC, but it's a technology, a bonnet system, where if a vessel comes in, you'll be able to cover the stack and capture emissions that way. That's something that's emerging as a new look or new opportunity for the industry in terms of capturing at berth emissions. In terms of the social equity piece, this is exactly right. Adjacent communities to ports are often considered to be sacrifice zones. They're particularly in Port Hueneme. We have a very large minority population. If we can develop green types of technologies, there's two things that can happen. One, immediately you have the direct relief from environmental mitigation. And then two, you can also develop a pipeline and workforce development into these new green technologies. And that's exactly what we're doing at the Port of Hueneme. We're looking at ways to interface and get our populations the education that they need. So there's direct pipelines to new job and social lifting our social equity at the Port of Hueneme through workforce developments, local project labor agreements to hire local community players and ensure apprentices and those types of things are happening so that we can really develop our workforce and uplift the economic health of our community, access to public health care and all of that.
Thank you. And I appreciate you submitting that information for the record, and without objection, it will be submitted regarding the awards that you referenced. And as somebody who grew up in that area, I'm very grateful for, again, the strides that the Port of Hueneme has made to ensure that there's a reduction of emissions and that the public's health is protected. So thank you. Mr. Rutherford, last week I introduced legislation that would double the authorization for the Maritime Environmental Technical Assistance Program, or META, within the Maritime Administration. This program provides funding for research and development of new technologies, such as alternative fuel sources. Can you speak to the sort of research the META program has resulted in and how this research has benefited your work? And what more could we do to bolster that program?
Thank you, Chairman Carbajal. The Maritime Environmental Technology Assistance Program has been an important program traditionally in helping foster new technologies to support the maritime sector in the United States. In particular, ICCT has over the years done a variety of research related to black carbon emissions from international shipping. This black carbon is the second most important climate forcer that's emitted from ships. It accounts for somewhere between 7 and 21% of the total greenhouse gas impact of shipping. And META, in fact, has funded some of that work along with partners at the University of California in Riverside. So that's, I think, one example of META work in this area that has been valuable over the years. I certainly think META will continue to have an important role in research and development in this sector, in a variety of new opportunities that Morgan and other participants today have discussed. So certainly electrification of the maritime sector, investments in technologies like shore power, alternative fuel development, and a variety of other technologies that need to be matured for deep sea ships no later than 2030.
Thank you. Mr. Fanberg, I represent a coastal district that has a large passenger and small vessel presence. Your company's work on electrification of ferries in Alabama is of great interest to me, and I can see how it might apply to other vessels in our domestic fleet. Do you see coastwise and domestic vessels, whether commercial or recreational, adopting this technology? And what can Congress do to help accelerate that shift?
Thank you, Chairman Carvajal, for the question, and thank you for recognizing our project in Alabama, the Gee's Bend Ferry. That it was a great example of a retrofit, an existing ferry that was able to secure grant funding and convert from diesel to all electric. So your question about transferring that to other entities, yes, absolutely. Obviously, depending on the route of the ferry or the small craft, it will depend greatly on that route and whether or not it's applicable for all battery power. So there's no question that there are so many other vessels as they age out and new construction projects start that these vessels could be ripe for an all-electric propulsion system. To encourage that, more projects like the Gee's Bend Ferry. In my state, we're also working on a project up in Skagit County to replace a 41-year-old diesel-powered passenger and car ferry. That will be another project that if we can get more funding will be all electric. So to encourage other municipalities and ferry systems and private operators to go all electric, we need more of those initial projects to showcase the technology and actually show that there's a reduction in maintenance costs and life cycle costs when you can move from a diesel engine to just a rotating electric motor. So I'm very encouraging.
Thank you very much. Next, we will go to the distinguished gentleman from Long Beach, Representative Lowenthal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I greatly appreciate your describing me. But I really also want to thank you, Chairman Carvajal, for your leadership in greening the maritime industry. And I also want to thank the panel. Reducing maritime emissions is really critical for priority for the well-being of our planet and can have a tremendous impact upon port communities such as I represent the largest port complex in the Western Hemisphere. That's the port. I represent the Port of Long Beach, which is part of the LA Long Beach Port Complex. And so my port backs up right into the Port of LA. It's really one large complex. So my first question is really for Dr. Kinberg. It is very exciting, Dr. Kinberg, your ability to launch a carbon neutral vessel within 2 years. And you've already begun to talk a little bit about what are some of the issues in scaling up the technology. And so I have a two-part question. One is, when am I going to see a carbon neutral vessel at the Port of Long Beach? I am interested in your larger ships, and when am I going to see a carbon neutral vessel there? And then the question is, what else do you need to do to have the industry move in this direction? We've seen the progress that you're saying the industry side to have this carbon neutral vessel within 2 years. What do you think is needed to ensure that these new shipping fuels such as methanol are pushed to markets and so you can become competitive? What role can we play? Thank you.
First, Congressman Lowenthal, first let me thank you for your continued leadership to our industry and your long-term involvement. It's always good to see you.
It's always good to see you too.
Yes, it is more difficult this way, isn't it? I would say that in terms of when, I would love to bring some of these bio-based fuel ships here today. And we are talking to various fuel suppliers and so forth, because as you know, to be able to make those long trips, we have to have fuel at both ends. So that's one of the things that we're talking to a number of people about, to get that fuel arranged to be able to do the biofuels, which we can do in existing ships. And then for some of the new fuel ships, again, I'd love to see them come here. Um, Again, we're talking to fuel suppliers. We have to be able to arrange the needed renewable fuels. And I can get into more detail with you if you're interested in more detail on that, but I won't take up all of your time with my enthusiasm here.
Well, I was just wondering, what role do you think that the federal government and this committee under the leadership of Representative Carbajal can play in bringing these fuels to market?
Well, I'd have to say, first of all, engage actively in setting the international frameworks for the global industry. We need goals and frameworks that are future proof, and those are being discussed right now. So the U.S. needs to play a very active role in those discussions. And we need to establish mechanisms that encourage and reward early actors and bring up the laggards, both the carrot and the stick. And we need global mechanisms to develop those new fuels and make them available and affordable. I also think the U.S. could leverage our R&D muscle and decades of experience in renewables to accelerate work on new fuels and energy systems and the landside infrastructure to support them, the national labs, the universities. We've got tremendous research muscle here, and we could use it and address that challenge.
Thank you. I have one question also following up on this to Mr. Rutherford, if I have time. Mr. Rutherford, I'm very pleased. I think it was in your written testimony. You talked about the possibility of hydrogen infrastructure in the San Pedro Bay. Well, that's ports of LA, Long Beach. Can you talk more about how we can develop and deploy this technology? I have not heard very much discussion of hydrogen fuel cells, and maybe you can talk about that, or hydrogen infrastructure that would be needed to propel hydrogen as an alternative fuel.
Thank you for the question, Congressman Lowenthal. I'm a little bit concerned about the time. I am happy to provide more details for the record, but within my written testimony, there are several links to studies that my organization have completed specifically on this question. So definitely encourage you to review those, and I'm happy to provide additional details for the record.
Thank you. I will do that and request that, Mr. Rutherford. I believe, I don't have in front of me.
I think you're out of time, Mr. Lowenthal. We're going to have a second round of questions, so certainly you're welcome. You're welcome back. Thank you so much, Mr. Lowenthal. With that, we'll go to the other distinguished gentleman from the state of Washington, Representative Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Fanberg, you might not be surprised, I'm going to ask you some questions. Skagit County is in my district, and the Guimas Island Ferry is the project you're talking about with Skagit. What is the physics of a electric-powered ferry in a channel like the Guimas Channel, which has tidal currents running back and forth, compared to diesel power? And what are the challenges of physics on that?
The challenges, you're talking about an area that has some extreme currents, and so that was part of our project, was to look at the environmental aspects of going to all electric. So when it comes to physics, it's obviously all about thrust and how quickly we can react in that channel, not only due to the environmental aspects, but also it's highly trafficked through that channel as well, as you know. So when it comes to the design, it's really about either matching what a diesel powered vessel can do when it comes to maneuverability. We also can look at different types of propulsion, whether it's an azimuthing thruster that can move the vessel in any direction, or even the propeller design can go into some of the physics and the maneuverability aspects.
Okay, so there are other design features you can incorporate in order to address any of the thrust challenges you get with electric versus the classic diesel.
Absolutely.
Yeah. On that, so Whatcom County, which is just north, has the ferry to Lummi Island, and they're looking at replacing their ferry as well. And you mentioned the funding issue. Just a note, in the Invest in America bill last year, which was incorporated into the Moving Forward bill last year. We did include low and no emission ferry funding in that. And I'll be pursuing that again this year over the next couple of weeks as we put together the infrastructure bill. So there's opportunities. Our state ferry system is the largest based on vehicles and passengers as well. Those are by scale much larger ferries than, say, what we're looking at in Skagit County. And I don't know if you're involved with the state ferry system discussion on electric. I know some other folks are. Again, getting to questions of scale and thrust and maneuverability, to make this a reality, this is where I'm getting at. I want to make this a reality. What do we need to be thinking about when it comes to these larger platforms compared to the smaller platforms you'll see in Skagit?
Congressman Larson, good question. And yes, we are involved in the Washington State Ferry projects. You know, there are two avenues there. They are looking to convert actually the ferry that I take home every day, the existing vessel, another conversion project to all electric, and then the new class of ferries. One of those, the fifth of the class, is in development to be an all-electric ferry. So the big issue when it comes to these longer routes, both of those will be all-electric. It's that infrastructure problem, getting the power to the dock. When you have a longer route, and if you need, you don't have enough battery capacity to do a round trip, it's about getting the infrastructure at both ends of the dock so you can recharge rapidly to make your return trip. So there's the big challenge right there. Just the battery technology exists, the engineering power is there to convert the vessels or to design them. It comes down to infrastructure and making sure we have power where we need it.
Yeah, and I don't mean to ask this facetiously, but just as a matter of scale, to go from Anacortes to Friday Harbor with stops in Orcas and Shaw, and I invite everyone to my district to do that, by the way, and call me anytime. Does the battery need to be as big as the ferry to make that round trip, or what is the scale? Because you're not stopping. You don't get to stop really long enough. You land the ferry, you unload, you load, you leave, hopefully all within 20 minutes.
Those ferries that are existing are large enough for the density of the battery. So again, battery technology has come a long way where the power you can get in a footprint now compared to 10 years ago, where you probably physically couldn't get a battery on those vessels to make those routes. So the density and the technology has come a long way where the ferry sizes that are existing up there, it shouldn't be a problem to get the right size battery.
Yeah, okay. Well, again, in my last 10 seconds, just remind folks, we did put language in the Moving Forward Act, which is in the Invest in America Act. We'll be pursuing that again. My office will be pursuing that again as part of the American Jobs Plan. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Larson. Now we're going to proceed with another round of questions for those members that would like to ask additional questions. Each member will be recognized for 5 additional minutes. And I will start with myself. In your testimony, Mr. Kinberg, you say that Maersk is responsible for 0.1% of the global CO2 emissions. Most companies would not volunteer that information. You then proceed to explain Maersk's plan to exceed the IMO's goals on emissions. Why is Maersk seemingly going above and beyond the international standards? Is there business case to be made here?
Well, first, of course, the right answer is that it's the right thing to do. So thanks for asking that question. But it's very important that our customers provide us demand signals that this is indeed something that they want, that they need, and that they are expecting us to do. And we actually have customers who are paying a premium today to ship net zero carbon shipping. That's a change just in the last 2 years. So we're really starting to see, I would have to say, a global change among cargo owners and shippers to really support some of these new investments.
Thank you. Mr. Butler, what are the requirements that must be developed for non-carbon-based fuel delivery and storage?
Mr. Chairman, there are a lot of things that have to happen seemingly all at once, but at the same time, they have to happen, I think, in a certain order, just as a matter of logic. I think in answer to your question, when you think about, for example, storage and delivery, the first thing you have to figure out is, well, what is it that I'm storing and delivering? So we have to look at, what technologies can safely be placed on the ships. And then you turn to the probably in many ways much more daunting question of, okay, how do we produce those fuels in a way that is itself low carbon or no carbon? We've heard a lot of talk about electricity today. That's not going to work on big ships. But just to take that as an example, you can power a vessel with electricity, but if the electricity is being generated by a coal-fired power plant, you haven't done a lot for greenhouse gases. So you do have
We
to
lost your
think-
microphone, Mr. Butler.
Is it back now?
We can hear you just a little fainter than before. Keep going. You're
Okay,
fine.
sorry about that. So to get back to the direct answer to the question, first you need to know what the fuel is, and then you have to figure out, what are the constraints on storage, production, and transportation of that fuel to make sure that it's available all the places that it has to be. So there's a series of steps that you have to take logically in order to answer that question.
Thank you very much. And this is to all witnesses. While we understand that research and development is underway, which fuels are best suited for international shipping, coastwise shipping, small passenger vessels, and tugboats?
I guess I can go first.
Don't all at once now.
If I could go first, Chairman Carvajal, I think from my perspective as an engineer, you look at the technologies that are already in development and already somewhat proven. So battery technology, as you've heard me mention, for more of the short routes when it comes to harbor craft and passenger ferries. And then, of course, hydrogen it might not be the most ideal going forward. And there may be better fuels in the future, but right now it actually can be used and very efficiently. And there's good fuel cell technology that can be powered by hydrogen. There could be future technology past hydrogen, but for right now, those are the two technologies that are the most promising.
Thank you. Anyone else?
I'll go, Chairman Carvajal, I'll just say from an infrastructure side from the port standpoint, now looking at vessel technology, the electric infrastructure is proven at ports. I will add, though, that there is one challenge, and what I think Congress should influence is entry into and incentivizes entry into the market. There's only one producer of shoreside power system, a company called Cavitec. So the ports in California compete for mechanics. There's really only one mechanic. So if our system goes down, there's only one mechanic that come out, and we compete for that. So entry to market's really important in encouraging R&D in these technologies. And then just in terms of our handling equipment and other infrastructure development, we too are looking at hydrogen solutions as a potential, and hydrogen fuel cells to run port operations that would complement what the vessel industry is doing.
Thank you. Why don't you conclude, Mr. Rutherford?
Thank you, Chairman Carvajal. Very much agree with Morgan and Kristen on this. To a first approximation, the problem is burning carbon fuels. So if you can move away from a fuel that contains carbon and move towards a fuel that can support electrification of ships, starting with the ships near port and eventually branching out to the deep sea ships, that's the ultimate long-term solution. So there we're talking about battery electric, hydrogen, and then some sort of hydrogen carrier, for example, ammonia or potentially green methanol.
Thank you. And Ms. Kinberg, I see you wanted to say something. So in conclusion, if you could conclude.
Thank you. I just can tell you what we're working on for our big ships. We are focusing on biodiesel and biofuels, renewable alcohols, those lignin fuels that I mentioned, the lignin alcohol blends, and ammonia. The ammonia is a longer-term option due to safety and design considerations. So that's where we're really focusing. You have to have a really energy-dense fuel to be able to cross the Pacific.
Thank you. Now, proceeding with the same complementary approach of all my colleagues, I'll go to our distinguished ranking member from Ohio, Mr. Gibbs.
Thank you, Mr. Distinguished Chairman. Mr. Butler, your organization, the World Shipping Council, proposes to establish an industry-funded International Maritime Research and Development Board and International Maritime Research Fund to accelerate the development of technologies to achieve low and zero carbon fuels. What happens if the industry-funded international research program is not established and market-based measures are left to drive the industry to shift to cleaner fuel technologies? Mr. Butler.
Congressman Gibbs, I'd rather focus on what happens if it is implemented. But to answer your question directly, without a well-funded international coordinated research and development effort, it's going to take the industry much longer to figure out what technologies are going to allow us to decarbonize.
Can you speak up just a little bit? You kind of fade away there.
Sure. Without that research and development activity, it's going to take the industry much longer to figure out which technologies and which fuels are going to be viable to allow us to decarbonize. That translates into, it takes us much longer to actually get the job done. And it also translates into a tremendous amount of investment uncertainty in the interim. So it's really critical that we use this mechanism of the IMRB to jumpstart that technological work. The sooner we do that, the sooner you see the private investment come off of the sidelines and go into building the infrastructure necessary to supply those fuels. So it's really a question of timing, and time is not on our side. So it's absolutely critical that we take this step.
Right. Dr. Kinberg, one of your colleagues sits on the board of the World Shipping Council, and after hearing Mr. Butler's testimony, I know you're kind of silent in your testimony about the establishment of this Research and Development Board and International Maritime Research Fund. Would you like to share your views on the establishment of this Fund and Development Board and the Maritime Research Fund?
We absolutely support the proposal. There does need to be a way to coordinate this work globally. Without that coordination, and it's not just the funding, it's also the convening power of a body like this that could ensure that you can work together without jeopardizing antitrust considerations and things like that. So this organization would do more than just handle the money. It would also convene and designate kinds of projects that would enable us to really accelerate this work and perhaps avoid dead ends.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Rutherford, I was trying to understand on your figure 3 in your testimony, it has Singapore almost looks like they have a monopoly on refueling, or they move a lot more fuel than all the rest of the ports around the world. Was there something significant about that, or is just Singapore so big they move a lot of fuel?
Thank you, Ranking Member Gibbs. Yes, Singapore definitely has advantages in terms of geography and also economies of scale for selling shipping fuels. One of the points I was trying to make with that figure is that because of today's a centralized fossil fuel bunkering system, it's possible for ports outside of the US to capture most of the fuel sales markets. That's because ships today are designed to have huge operating ranges. The largest ocean-going vessels, say container ships or tanker ships, they are capable of operating up to 50,000 miles but without refueling. Just to put that into perspective, that's a long enough distance to circumnavigate the world twice without refueling. As a result, those ships can refuel once in a major hub like Singapore, and then operate up to 90 days before refueling, back and forth to the United States, for example. So in contrast, some of these emerging zero carbon fuels have a lower energy density. That means that there will need to be some minor operational or design changes to make them work. But it also means that the fuels can be generated and used closer to port. And that could create new business opportunities, for example, in the ports of Southern California that Congressman Lowenthal was referencing earlier.
Thank you. And my time's up. I just make one quick comment, Mr. Chairman. Seems like there might be a lot of opportunities on some of these new biofuels that we might be able to get market share for that.
Absolutely.
Mention that. So thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Gibbs. Next, we'll go to Representative Auchincloss.
I'd like to thank Chairman Carbajal for convening this timely and important hearing. It's going to take a bold, all-of-government approach to overcome the challenges of the climate crisis, and this hearing gives us the opportunity to delve into some aspects of that. And in my district, local colleges and businesses are already investing in the R&D necessary to strengthen the maritime workforce. Dr. Kinberg, I am particularly happy to get to speak with you today because Maersk has partnered with Bristol Community College in my district to train students in wind skills development as part of the college's National Offshore Wind Institute, NOWI. Now this year, your company sold the world's first product tanker fit with wind propulsion technology to Norse Power rotor sails on board. And they showcase the drop in fuel consumption. So my question is there the opportunity to take at the nexus of offshore wind and wind propulsion technology a workforce development approach that trains people like the students at Bristol Community College and the skills necessary to advance both of those industries?
And I must confess that I'm not familiar with the program at Bristol Community College, and I apologize for that. We do work with colleges around the world and are big believers in workforce development. There will be a whole new set of skills needed to both build and install these new technologies and to maintain them and to handle all these fueling systems. So there absolutely will be needs for workforce development to support all of these things.
And do you think that there is, if you think of like a Venn diagram of the skills necessary to do offshore wind construction and maintenance and the skills necessary to do wind propulsion technology, how much of an overlap is there in terms of the programming that you would need for workforce development?
You know, I am not that familiar with Maersk tankers, the Flettner rotors that they have actually been using. I've heard that they are getting good results, but I'm not an expert on that one. Happy to get you some information if you'd need.
I'd be interested for that. Dr. Fanberg, perhaps I could turn to you and get your thoughts on this. Some ports are natural hubs for connecting offshore wind, like the places in my district, Brayton Point, for example, in Somerset, Massachusetts. My district is right onshore of the greatest natural offshore wind resource really in the Western Hemisphere, and we're working hard to take advantage of that and creating a cluster in the southeastern Massachusetts devoted to offshore wind. Do you see a nexus between offshore wind manufacturing, logistics, R&D with wind propulsion for international shipping?
Thank you, Representative Auchincloss. So the crossover between the wind energy and wind technology for vessels, there is first of all, supporting the offshore wind industry off the coast of the East Coast is going to be a very large boom for the whole maritime industry in general. So maybe there's no crossover between the skill set for installing wind turbines and the skill set for operating a vessel like Maersk with the Flettner rotor, but there certainly will be a crossover in the maritime industry when it comes to jobs and the maritime industry together. I don't necessarily see a crossover in the skill set for offshore wind and operating a vessel with Flettner rotors or other wind technology, except for the engineering side of things. I think when it comes to the installation of offshore wind, certainly when we do deep sea offshore wind, there is a crossover in skill set for naval architects to combine both of those technologies. So there is something there.
That's helpful feedback. I appreciate that. And one of the things I expect Massachusetts will become a leader on is not just the installation, maintenance, operations, but also the latest R&D around this. Massachusetts is famous for its product development and putting the best minds to work on hard manufacturing problems. And I could see that there could be synergies between the best R&D for offshore wind and taking some of those learnings and applying them to wind propulsion. And I think Bristol Community College might be one of the leading centers of excellence for that. Mr. Chair, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Representative Auchincloss. Next, we'll go to Representative Maliatakis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to follow up on some of the questions of the ranking member regarding, setting the achieving targets for greenhouse gas reduction that has been set up by the International Maritime Organization. In particular, I was wondering, and I guess this is a question for Mr. Butler, if you envision the industry being able to convert existing vessels to these new fuels. You touched on it slightly, but I'm wondering what you would think the cost to shippers and consumers would be, and if they were to scrap existing vessels early, what would be the impact on that as well? And if you have any information or insight into the construction costs of new decarbonized vessels compared to the current vessels.
Congresswoman, thank you for the question. I'll ask first whether you can hear me. I know there was a problem.
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. I mean, I'm sorry to say that I can't give you very precise numbers about the cost of all of this because we don't know quite yet what this is. I've spoken earlier, we don't know which fuels and their related technologies are going to end up being the long-haul investments that the industry makes for the deep sea sector. And whether or not those technologies and fuels will be suitable for retrofit is similarly an open question. I think it is safe to say that, at least in the short term, as we make this conversion, costs are going to go up. I think we need to be honest about that. And I really can't see a scenario where, at least based on what we know now, we have a no-cost transition. There will be cost. And that's one of the reasons that it's so absolutely critical that we avoid going down dead ends. And that means doing the research and development on the front end to figure out as early as possible which technologies are going to pan out.
Thank you, I appreciate that, and certainly looking at the economic impact of all this, I think should be a priority before we go down this path. And the second question I have, in recent conversations with the aviation industry, they had been talking about technology that they feel they can implement that would reduce fuel emissions, and this is a question for everyone. If you see that anything specific that you can share with us regarding possibly the same opportunities in the shipping and vessel industry.
Well, shall I jump into that one first?
Sure.
And thank you for your question. I'm not sure exactly which technology you're talking about in the aviation industry, but I can tell you that over the last 5 years, we've done what we called our radical retrofit program to make dramatic energy efficiency improvements on about 100 of our vessels. And that program cost us $1 billion.
Could you share a little more about some of the impact that has had and how many vessels and some of the success that you've seen?
Case, well, some of the success, these are vessels that commonly call the United States. And let me give an example. In Southern California, sorry, we also do call Port of Authority of New York, New Jersey, but the example in Southern California is one I happen to know quite well because we did a study with the ports and with Scripps Institution of Oceanography. So not only did we improve energy efficiency of those vessels, we also reduced underwater radiated noise, which has an impact on the whales in the Santa Barbara Channel and other places. So that happened to be a win-win, but we were just very fortunate to be able to have found that sweet spot. And we hope that underwater radiated noise and other environmental impacts can also be benefited. So we really have to look at the whole picture and not just greenhouse gases.
Mm-hmm.
Congresswoman, to complement what Mariska's saying, we do take on one of their vessels in a liner service once a week in the port of Wanimi, and they religiously plug in their vessel at berth, and that has led to profound impacts on the environment locally here in our community, 85% reductions from shoreside power systems. So that's a technology pursuing. And I think as the conversation moves forward around all these new fuels in the shipping industry, it's really important that ports are at the table so they understand the infrastructure needs that are going to drive and coordinate with what's happening on the vessel side. So we're not working in silos, building one infrastructure at the ports and a different infrastructure for the vessels. So that's going to be a very important part of the conversation.
Thank you. Does anyone have any comments on what the potential impact will be of establishing zero emission refueling stations in American ports, both environmentally and economically?
I'll speak to that. I can tell that you in Port of Hueneme, it's interesting. We had $4 million in our reserves when I started in 2012, and we were regulated to build a $14 million system, and we got it done. So it takes innovation and creativity and working with different partners and investment, and we got it all across the board from the state, from the EPA. We got a new market tax credit deal to help us build the infrastructure. To scale that up in the larger ports, LA and Long Beach invested well over 100 million in infrastructure. But again, the payoff has been in the return to the communities in terms of really significant and tangible emission reductions. So it's a solid investment, but the ports can't bear those costs alone, that we do need the assistance and the subsidies coming from state and federal government so that we can really transition and transform into a decarbonized transportation network. In my testimony, I said it's going to be about $35 million in California alone to retrofit our ports to zero emission electric technology.
Thank you.
With that, that concludes our hearing for today. I would like to thank each of the witnesses for their testimony today. I ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing. I also ask unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered, the subcommittee stands adjourned.